Hey everyone, Tisai, your Prince London, and today we're gonna go over the League of Nations. If you're familiar with the League of Nations, you should know that, well, you should know what it is exactly, but if you're not, let me just get started. It was the first intergovernmental organization that had peace as its sole purpose. It was created in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles after World War One, and it didn't formally dissolve, but it turned into the United Nations after World War Two. Now, if you know something about the League of Nations, is that it could be considered the mother of the UN. Just some sort of fun fact. It is the mother. Not exactly, but kind of. This is the semi-official shield. I have a problem drawing stars. So there we go. Let me get a chair because my knees are aching, man. Okay, there we go. There's one thing you should know is that the United Nations was never meant to exist because a war was not supposed to break out. The Second World War shouldn't have happened in the first place. A first one, well, not the first one, the Great War. Well, it is the first one, but at the time they weren't counting, they weren't numbering them because it was only an isolated incident at the time. But the second one was never meant to exist. It was never meant to happen because these guys, the League of Nations, they were supposed to stop the war, but they didn't. They were supposed to mediate and avoid conflict and use words. We use our words, people, but they don't. So also I'm gonna be reading of this essay that I'm gonna be selling in the description, just so you guys are familiar. As I said, it was never meant to exist. It started in 1919 after the First World War. I think I'm gonna have to get rid of this thing because it's taking up a lot of space actually. And I don't know, it's not the prettiest thing, is it? So it started after the First World War. That's when the great powers got together and they were like, hey, we should really do something to make sure this doesn't happen again. Mainly the United States. And I'm gonna get into it because it's quite an interesting story. The United States never joined the League of Nations, but US President Woodrow Wilson could be the man described as responsible for the League in the first place. So there we go. The First World War was from 1914 to 1918. We get World War One. Talks of League of Nations, they started in 1915, mainly in the UK and the US, because conflict was everywhere. They really wanted peace. They wanted to make sure that there was a way to stop this without going into total oblivion, but obviously it materialized. A certain guy, Woodrow Wilson. What a cool name, Woodrow. Well, I'm an international relations major, and I'm gonna go over a little international relations theory and explain why his theory failed. So in international relations, we have the theory of liberalism and realism. Liberalism, the main author, the main person, the spokesperson for this is Woodrow Wilson. Liberalism is this theory that looks at peace as natural, and it interprets war as an accident. Whereas realism is the other way around. War is the natural state of things, whereas peace is something that we actively have to be on the lookout for. Peace is unnatural. And those were the two theories. Those are the two, no word, they are the two theories. Liberalism, where is my toilet paper? The one I used to erase things of the board. Okay, here it is. Liberalism Obviously, the main thing it did, it, it created the League of Nations. It lasted from 1919, the theory, until the Second World War. The world, we have to understand the political climate of the world and what it was happening, well, not what was happening and how it was happening. So we got liberalism, and this is all international relations. So let me just get more space because I fear I'm gonna need it. I need to really glue this to the desk, because we really need to understand why states were willing to come together. Just like, oh, a war broke out and we came together. No, it didn't happen like that. You know, we got the Tsarist Russia, we got the monarchy in the UK, we got colonialism, we got the American and French Revolution. It was a whole lot of things that happened before the world was ready to say, okay, you know what, I think we're better off together. So we gotta take a quick look into international relations. And I feel like my college professors, shout out to you, Professor Tavorda. So international relations. You can analyze international relations under two lenses. The first one as a science, which is what gives birth to liberalism and realism, and as a phenomenon. So international relations have always happened in a way. States have always needed to communicate with other states when it comes to trade, when it comes to many different things. But we really need to understand the origins of the League of Nations to be able to say, okay, it failed because of this. Well, liberalism, that's factor number one. It failed. You know what? I'm gonna write this here. Factor number one, liberal principles. Liberal principles. That's factor number one. And now let's go into the events itself that shaped the political climate and the ideological climate. These are ideologies. The League of Nations was born of an ideology, okay? Most historical events can predict the future. If we are able to understand and accurately analyze them, we can predict the future. History will just keep repeating itself. And this has proved true time and time again. So now, as a phenomenon, the desire for unity in terms of international relations, let me get the red one, started in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. Now, why would you be familiar with this? I actually have no idea, so that's why I'm going to go over the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia essentially was one of the first meetings, probably the first time the Europeans gladly came together and settled on some boundaries for themselves. And this is more of an international relations thing, but let me just go over it just in case. Before Westphalia, the state system, it relied on anarchy. What Westphalia did is that it gave sovereignty, territorial sovereignty to the states. It was considered the birth of the modern state system in Westphalia. Let me just read what I have here. It ended an anarchical rule and instead established a system of relative territorial sovereignty. The Peace of Westphalia marked the end of the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic, as well as the German phase of the 30 Years' War, a period in Europe that cost the lives of around 8 million people. Negotiations began in 1644 in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück. The treaty between Spain and the Dutch was signed in 1648, and it finalized on October when the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand and other princes from Germany, France, and Sweden were part of the discussions. This is the foundation of the modern state system. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Well, not exactly bad news, but I'm gonna draw you a little map. I'm doing this from memory, okay? This is a European map. This is the UK, and, well, Denmark, Norway, okay, okay. Everything we know now, how we understand and how we analyze the world, we do through a Eurocentric lens. We do so through European eyes. Why? Because they took over the world. We understand politics because of Westphalia. Westphalia is a European thing, and we understand things from a European point of view. And unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not gonna get into which is better or which one's not, but I'm just gonna say that regardless of if we like it or not, we need to understand politics and history through a European lens. They took over the world. They colonized the world. I made a video on the British Empire, by the way. Go watch it. But enough of the self-promotion. They took over the world. Westphalia established territorial sovereignty. If you want to know what else was happening at the time, well, in 1624, the colony of Virginia was established in the United States. The Pilgrims were, well, making pilgrimage to America. What else was happening in 1648? See, this is almost 200 years after the Europeans arrived in the Americas. So, you know, this we're picking up. We are picking up. Before this, well, of course, we had international treaties and stuff like that. Now, this was the first one. This established sovereignty as a principle. Whether it was a liberal principle or not, I'm gonna get into that later. Well, not later, I mean, like, right now. This was in 1648, and now we come into the Age of Enlightenment. This was all in the Age of Enlightenment. Now, you may be familiar with the Age of Enlightenment, but in case you're not, it came after the Dark Ages, and it was supposed to be this era of thinkers that shaped how we see the world today. So in 1637, we got Rene Descartes. He released, what did he release? The discourse method, which is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. Isn't that the Billie Eilish song? Sorry. I think, therefore I am. Now in 1651, and this guy's gonna be the main proponent, the main one when it comes to the realist theory. We got Thomas Hobbes. And these are theories. The realist theory is the one that prevails today. We understand the world through a lens of realism. So we got Thomas Hobbes. He released Leviathan, in which he used the biblical monster to explain politics and states' interactions. And I'm not going to go into Leviathan. If you guys want a separate video on the monster, I'm going to do a separate video on the monster, not this one. Now, we move forward a couple years later, and we get John Locke. These are all guys, by the way. Why? Because men had all the power back then. Oopsies. Well, why am I apologizing? I would have been fine. So this is 1689. And he released the Treatise of Civil Government. Now we move over, almost 100 years later, we arrive at 1762. And if you're not familiar with this, guys, you will be familiar with this one. 1672, we get the social contract. The social contract. And the social contract, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I don't know why I did French. See, these are all Europeans. And like it or not, this was not going on in the Americas. This was not happening in Africa. That's a fact. We also, well, this doesn't matter, just to make it here. We got the Industrial Revolution. And, okay, we have this great thinkers that influence international relations as a whole. Who am I gonna stick with the most? Well, I'm gonna pick blue and I'm gonna choose Hobbes. If there are two people that you should take from this, are Hobbes and the social contract. The social contract build a principle for liberalism. John Locke did as well, but to a lesser extent, whereas Hobbes did the same thing for realism. So this is all the age of enlightenment, or the age of reason and enlightenment. Something like that. Point is, people were thinking. Mercantilism, it was no longer the option. We were moving on to a capitalist system in England, especially. Moving on to a capitalist system in England. Leaving behind mercantilism. And now, let us move on from this. Okay, we got that Westphalia was great. It furthered liberalism. It established the modern state. Westphalia also did another thing, because now there was such thing as, I am saying thing a lot, I'm sorry, because now there was such thing as territorial sovereignty. European states were like, okay, I cannot go and just take over France, because that's gonna be a violation, that's gonna be looked down upon. But what about areas that haven't been claimed in other parts of the world, such as Louisiana? So kind of Westphalia is sort of to blame, relatively, in terms of, okay, I can't take over Europe. What about the lands that Europeans haven't claimed? Because Europeans are the only ones that matter. So that's what they did. They took over the world. I shouldn't be laughing. The peoples of the Americas have never fully recovered from this, and the effects of the slave trade have historically disserviced Africa, Black Africa, might I add. So there we go. European expansionism, it's sort of, if Europe was not going to go against each other, they were going to come together and go against the world. We got the first feelings of togetherness, okay? Ooh. And this is a part I'm going to just read straight off the bat, because Westphalia indirectly contributed to European expansionism. They started exploiting the land and cooperating so as to make themselves, and therefore Europe, the richest to this day continent on earth. Well, there's a few sentences there that are not totally accurate. Well, at least in terms of how rich everyone is. The richest continent on earth is Asia, but that's mainly because of China and India. The poorest countries in Europe are better off than the poorest countries in Asia, the Americas, Africa, or Australia for that matter. On average, Europeans have a better quality of life just because they are in Europe. So this is an effect of colonialism that gave the Europeans an unfair advantage to the rest of the world. This can be seen in the Covenant of the League of Nations, and how it allowed for further colonies to be established via mandates and dominions, giving Europeans control over territories in Asia and Africa, such as Palestine. And I'm gonna take us back and move over to the 18th century again. But before I do, the European Union, this is why the European Union is the most successful international organization there is. It's the magnum opus of international organizations. Why? Well, because they've gone through all this together. At this point in time, they no longer care about empires or who's the biggest, who's the baddest, who's the richest. They just care about stability, about coming together and being powerful together, because apart, they are not who they once were. So, and this guy, I know I said the same thing about other guys, so you probably think that I'm some sort of whore. Well, I'm not a whore, I'm an historian. So, we get Immanuel Kant in 1795. 1795, we get Immanuel Kant with his essay titled Perpetual Peace. In this essay, it was the first mention or idea or sentiment of, what if the world came together? What if we all came together as a supranational thing and just supervised the behaviors of the members. That's essentially what he proposed. He proposed frameworks for lasting peace through republican governments and international cooperation. That's what he did in 1795. The League of Nations happened in 1919. This is back to back to back to back. This may seem like, okay, a couple hundred years apart, but his grandchildren lived all the way to 1989. Well, I'm not sure that's true. Don't quote me on that. But it could have been possible. Exactly. So it's not that far-fetched, an idea. At this point in time, 1795, the American Revolution had happened. The American Constitution had been ratified. The French Revolution, the first one, had also been successful. So this is what's happening in the world. America, well, the Confederation, they realized, hey, if the Europeans are taking over the world, we can do the same thing. Okay, we could do the same thing. So let's claim sovereignty, Westphalia, and let's take over the world ourselves. Hence Puerto Rico, hence California, Louisiana, Alaska, Hawaii. See, well, we could start tracing all of this back to Westphalia, but I'm not going to blame some German city because of all of this. I'm blaming this guy. Actually, there's no one to blame. I'm just going over histories. So, one of the main criticisms that the liberal theory faces is that it is too utopian, too idealistic, because we rely on the, what would I say? I don't know how to say it or how to describe it, but we rely as a state depends on another state's heart. They depend on their purity and of their intentions. So, who knows? The interests between states are harmonious here. So that's a thing that the liberals face. It's like, it's too utopian. It's not real. Because people at the core are selfish. That's what Hobbes proposed. That's what Kant proposed. Kant was sort of both. Kant took the best of Rousseau, he took the best of Hobbes, and he put them together and he created perpetual peace. That's what he did. I can make a video on him, but there are already tons of great videos on Immanuel Kant. The age of exploration was still happening. We are now moving on to the 18th and 19th century, so we get the scramble for Africa and the Great Game. I go over this briefly on my British Empire video. Scramble, Africa, and the Great Game. Again, Europeans expanding, taking over the world. I don't like the 19th century. It is quite boring, I must say. I'm sorry, it is quite boring. But in the essay that I wrote, I wrote a thing about the 19th century, so I guess I have to go over it, huh? So, in the 19th century, we get some interesting things. We get the Napoleonic Wars. We get the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were this series of wars. Well, they were the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, it's going to be a series of wars. Well, point is that in 1815... should I use pink? I fear, no, let's just keep using red. In 1815, Napoleon was defeated. The French went back to a monarchy. It was a whole thing, okay? Keep in mind the first revolution was in 1789, so less than 20 years later, Napoleon was defeated. The Napoleonic Wars were this series of conflicts between, well, Napoleon, which was France, and we also get the first UN-like cooperation, which is the Holy Alliance. The Holy Alliance went against France because Napoleon was proposing a republic. He was proposing the social contract. He was threatening monarchies. The Holy Alliance was against this. Who was part of the Holy Alliance, may you ask? Well, we got Russia, We get Austria, not Australia, Austria. Well, that was pretty obvious, huh? We got Austria, we got Russia, and we got Prussia. So, Russia. Fun fact, Britain was invited to join, but it didn't because they prioritized a relationship with the French. Yeah, they had a relationship, guys. They had commercial ties over in the colonies in the Americas, in the Pacific. They needed the French to be on their good side. Okay, so that's why they didn't join the Holy Alliance. But eventually, Napoleon was defeated, and the Holy Alliance set the stage for international cooperation. It promoted Christian principles such as justice, charity, and peace. What happened in 1815? The Holy Alliance, Europe came together again, per the principles of Westphalia. It had the Congress of Vienna. This video is all over the place, guys. If you stuck together, if you have stuck with me for the past 26 minutes, subscribe. Congress of Vienna that same year, 1815, and they created the Concert of Europe. Yes, the Concert of Europe. We are moving through stages of cooperation that are... See, this is back to back to back, okay? The Concert of Europe was established after the wars at the Congress of Vienna. It was designed to maintain the balance of power among European states and preserve the status quo, thereby reducing the likelihood of war, while the Holy Alliance focused on religion and moral principles, such as monarchical rule. The Concert of Europe was more pragmatic, emphasizing diplomacy and negotiation among the great powers. I already read that. They collaborated to address issues like territorial disputes, independence movements, and often intervening to protect monarchical systems. Again, this is quite a long story, so if you guys want a story on how the international system came to be from this to the United Nations, let me know. Another thing that I must mention, and now we're moving on to the 20th century, so thank you God, because the 19th century, Jesus Christ, it's not something I enjoy talking about. But we see Europe has gone through wars. Europe, we got the Concert, we got Westphalia, we got a lot of things that are signaling an unity. And this is one of the pitfalls of the League of Nations. Only Europe understood the urgency. So it was Eurocentric. What do I mean by this? No other continent has gone through as much conflict as Europe has, at least in the past 300 years. Europe understood that wars couldn't happen again. Europe got the sense of urgency, whereas the rest of the world didn't. The rest of the world did not sign up to be members of the League because they were like, okay, but we don't have conflict here. If there's a war in Europe, I don't care about the war in Europe. That's what, I don't know, a country in the middle of the Caribbean could have said. Because they did not get the urgency or the fear of war. And that was the thing that Immanuel Kant, he touched on his essay Perpetual Peace, released in 1795. Go buy it. Not just kidding, he's dead. But point is that he talked about how if we as humans, as a society, felt the burden of war, we would choose peace immediately. Because war is something that is rotten to the core. He said something like that. Let me get rid of Westphalia. We should get another thing. So now we're moving on to 1899. We get the IUP, the Interparliamentary Union. Okay, IPU. Interparliamentary Union. And I'm going to read a brief summary on this. It was founded by peace activists William Randall and Frederick Passy. It is still active today, and it was established to promote international cooperation and peaceful resolution with the focus on involving the world's elected legislative bodies. By 1914, it had grown to include one-third of the parliament from 24 countries. The IPU held annual conferences to refine arbitration processes and feature a council led by a president, later echoed in the League of Nations. This is 1889. What happened in a couple of years? Let's go back. Let's rewind. So we got the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, 1815. We get the Napoleonic Wars, the Holy Alliance, that's also 1815. Let's go even further back. We get the Perpetual Peace, 1795. All throughout the age of Enlightenment, from 1630 something to the French Revolution, we get all of these authors. We get the Social Contract, we get Leviathan, we get John Locke, we get Descartes. We move back a couple hundred years and we reach Westphalia. So this is back to, but this is all a linear thing, okay? We get the Hague Conventions of, is this 1899 and 1907. The Hague Conventions. This was the first real attempt at making something of the League of Nations. They were significant international treaties aimed at regulating the rules of warfare and promoting the peaceful resolution of disputes. These conferences marked an early effort to establish laws of wars and mechanisms for international cooperation. The first one introduced rules of the treatment of prisoners of war, the prohibition of certain weapons, and the establishment of a permanent court of arbitration. The 1907 one expanded and strengthened these principles, addressing issues such as the rights and duties of neutral states and the conduct of hostilities, making these conventions foundational to modern international humanitarian law. I'm not the best reader, as you guys have been able to tell. But point is, they regulated weapons, and they regulated hostilities. Now in 1910, I don't like 20th century. I know I complain about 19th century history, but I'm gonna complain about this history as well, 20th century history, because it's so packed. It's so packed and it's so recent. We can still feel the effects today. How good do I look? I look pretty great. So we get the 1910 Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions have been happening all throughout the years, but this is the first one. Well, they actually started in 1864, but they've been happening. But this is the first one that I give. Your Prince London declared the 1910 Geneva Convention the most important one. That's not real journalism, that's subjective. So they lay the foundation for humanitarian laws during wartime. They focus on protection of wounded soldiers, medical personnel, and civilians, ensuring humane treatment and impartial aid during armed conflicts. If you go over to 1914, we get World War I. In 1918, we get the end of World War I. And we move over to 1919 in Versailles. So, here's the thing. Despite all of the treaties and conventions, there wasn't one organization that was actively supervising what the states were doing. There wasn't a body that was directly overseeing anything. There was just a lot of treaties, a lot of things in the air that were not connected. They were not linked together. That's one of the things that they failed at. So how can we put this into words? They failed at supervision, exactly. So the states had a lot of papers to go through before they did something. It wasn't clear, so they might have, if there's a lot of rules, there's no rules at all. Because the rules contradict each other, whatever. Germany went at it, Italy went at it, Japan went at it, Britain went at it, France did as well. It was It was the war. It was also called the European Civil War because it was mainly fought in Europe with some strange factions fought in the in Asia. I was gonna say the Americas. The Americas were not involved in this one. Yes, they were not involved in this one. So I'm gonna get this. Okay. I said that we have been studying international relations as a phenomenon. But now it's time we focus on it as a science. As a science. Why? Because that's where we get the liberal principles from. That's where we get the actual thing that failed the world, the League of Nations. It did a lot of good things, by the way. I might add, I'm gonna go into this later, just briefly, but it did good things. Like, it wasn't a bad thing. This needed to happen, but it just wasn't the most effective, and therefore, I'm calling it out. Oh, more than 100 years later. So, as a science, it started in 1919 at the University of Wales. Actually, let's keep the pink for science. President Woodrow Wilson, my man. Oh my man, I love him so. He'll never know. So what did he do? He was the proponent of the League of Nations. His theory was founded on liberalism. It is believed that peace is the natural state of things when it comes to war. He looked at it as an accident, something unnatural that is to be prevented. This theory ruled from 1919 until 1939, the start of the Second World War. He did a lot for the world, Wilson, but his hands were tied behind his back. He was essentially dancing with his hands tied. He proposed the League of Nations through a speech, through a beautiful, quintessential speech he pronounced in 1918 that we call it now, we refer to it now as the 14 points of Wilson. So the first point, should I write them down? There are 14, I don't know. The first point is open diplomacy. Open diplomacy. Second point, economic free trade. Free trade. The third point, equal trade conditions. Equal trade. Point number 4, decrease armaments amongst all nations. Lower arms. Point 5, adjust colonial claims. Colonialism. See, this is what led to Palestine being a mess. I have a video on that. Go watch it. I'm just kidding. Return of all French territories. This one had to do with France, so we're not going to go into it. 7. Belgium. This one had to do with Belgium. I'm not getting into it. It was pretty common for states to call out each other back in the day, all throughout the 20th century. No, actually, the 6th one is about Russia. Guys, I messed up the order. Well, now that the 0.6, 7, and 8 are messed up. But 9 had to do with Italy. 10 had to do with Austria-Hungary. 11 had to do with the Balkans. Wow, did this man really just call out every single region in the world? No, he didn't. The 12, he had to do with Turkey. 13 had to do with Poland. And this is the most important one, the 14, the creation of the League of Nations. He called it out like that, the League of Nations. Actually, let's see if I can find the actual thing. 14 points of Wilson. 14 points, Wilson. And let me just, point number 14. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. And this leads us to why it failed. The US didn't, they never joined. They didn't. Woodrow wanted to, but American Congress didn't want to because they did not feel the effects of the war. Only Europe had felt how devastating war could be. Therefore, they knew the urgency. But keep in mind, what about, okay, this is the world, exactly. So we get Europe here, we get Africa, Asia, Australia. So only Europe knew how important the League of Nations was. The rest of the world didn't. You could argue that maybe some parts of Asia, but they didn't. Not in the Americas. So the US didn't join. I hate to be the one that says this, but the US has been an important player over the last 200 years. I could make a video on the American Empire. I say that about a lot of topics, but throughout the war, throughout 1914 to 1918, the idea of a collective of nations coming together to prevent or stop conflict started gaining popularity, especially in Britain and the US. At the start of World War I, support for an international organization grew. Political scientist Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson coined the terms League of Nations in 1914. He became influential in advocating for international arbitration. Dickinson's 1915 pamphlet proposed a League of Peace, focused on diplomacy and public control of foreign policy to prevent war. In 1915, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was founded after a conference in the US that sought to establish a diplomatic mediating body. Meanwhile, the League to Enforce Peace was founded in the US and advocating for arbitration and sanctions. By 1916, both British and American leaders, including Wilson, began drafting plans for a global organization to ensure peace. Wilson pronounced the words of the 14 points in 1918, and British Secretary Arthur Balfour stressed the need for international sanctions to deter aggression. Now, who is this Arthur Balfour? Well, if you're familiar with the Middle East, Arthur is the man who pronounced the Balfour Declaration. It was written, the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration essentially promised a Jewish state to the Jews and completely disregarded that Britain had proposed an Arab state to the Arabs a couple of years back. If I'm not wrong, just a year ago. So, well, not 2 years ago. So there we go. That's Arthur Balfour. And the US didn't join. This is all part of liberalism, right? If you want to know more on colonialism, I assure you that you gotta read the Covenant of the League of Nations, Article 22. My memory's insane, guys. I'm on fire. I'm on fire today. Can I write it? I'm on fire. What if I get a tattoo? Would it be cool? But yes, point is, that's what happened. The League lacked its own armed force. They had no army. Does the UN have an army? You could argue that NATO is its army. But they do have forces such as UNEF, or is UNEF United Nations Special Forces. They got peacekeeping forces. They got people. That's what I mean. Back then they didn't. Okay. Sanctions could hurt League members, but they were reluctant to join because of that in the first place. Because who wanted to be sanctioned? No one wants to be sanctioned. So that's why all states did not join the League of Nations. It probably had like 58 states at its peak. Compare that to the 190 plus states that are in the UN. while combining member states and observers and, all states. I'm gonna go into this. The idea of the League of Nations is approved at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. This is in January. In June, the covenant is included in the Treaty of Versailles, right here. Should we make an arrow for it? Shall we? Well, not Article 22, the covenant. Although Article 22 you should read if you're interested in colonial effects in modern history. The first meeting takes place in November. The headquarters are in Geneva, Switzerland. So that's one of the things they got right? It was headquartered in Switzerland, probably the most neutral country on the planet. So, for someone that doesn't know how to draw, I sure draw a lot. So, Geneva, Switzerland HQ. Whereas the UN has its headquarters where? New York, darling. They established the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1921 in The Hague. So I'm afraid it's gonna fall on me. We get the resolution of the Allen Islands between Finland and Sweden in October of that same year. This was successful, but again, Finland and Sweden, if you wanna, that's easy to solve, okay? Finland and Sweden, that was 1921. 1925, the Locarno Treaties, reconciliation between Germany, France, and Belgium. This was 1925. This was Germany, France, and Belgium. Now we go into 1931, which we get the München incident. 1931, so it dealt with Japan's invasion. I can make a video on Japanese expansionism. It's actually a really cool subject. And before I fell drawn to Middle Eastern policies, I was a Japan guy. Now we move on to 1933. Japan is sanctioned. So they withdraw. And all the other states that were gonna get sanctioned, they started withdrawing as well. So Germany left under Hitler. Germany, Deutschland, withdrew. Why did they do so? Well, because where's the sense of urgency? I've been saying that Europe has felt the devastating effects of the war, but, Hitler was kind of crazy, and there was nothing. The First World War was fought in the trenches, okay? Whereas the second one, when you see a town blown up to pieces, 2 towns in a matter of seconds, I'm talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when you create the power to erase societies like that in the blink of an eye comes to life, the world comes to death. When the human race itself is threatened, that's when states around the world are like, okay, now people have nuclear arms, what's happening? We gotta keep it together, okay? We gotta join and make sure this doesn't happen again. Because even though Japan suffered from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the rest of the world was scared. And I would say now that in 2024, it rings true as well. Because nuclear arms are scary. They're a threat to human race and human civilization. What happened in 1935? Well, in 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia. I was going to say Utopia. Ethiopia. What happened in 1936? Germany remilitarizes and they violate the Treaty of Versailles. They started the invasions in 36. Okay, 36. 1939, Spain withdraws from the League after the Spanish Civil War. So in 39, Spain withdraws. Look at all this. People could just withdraw because there was no real thing to be afraid of. This was 1939. The League is inactive because of World War II. The UN is founded and is effectively replaced the League of Nations. The League of Nations is dissolved in 1946 and its assets are transferred to the UN. It is notable that at its peak, the League only had less than 60 members, yeah, I was right, excluding powerful nations such as the US, Germany, Japan, Italy, well, not Italy, Spain. I said Spain already, huh? Well, they weren't, even though wars had happened, they weren't the end of civilization, they weren't a threat to human existence, just a means to an end. But, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki came around and that whole thing changed. With international relations, current liberalism at the time, people relied on God, the word escaping me. When you want to do things for others just for good, people relied on the goodness of other people. That's not the word I'm looking for. And that just simply wasn't the case, not after World War II. Not after World War II. And this is the primary thing that I think that most political scientists and journalists ignore. And when it comes to criticizing the United Nations, is that they often criticize the bureaucracy, the veto system, the Security Council. But the bureaucracy is there for a reason. It is there for a reason. Okay? It is needed because of the effects of war. The League of Nations, it was visionary, it faced significant challenges in enforcing its principles. Its failure to prevent aggression by powerful states like Japan, Italy, Germany, it contributed to its decline. However, its establishment, like the International Labour Organization, and initiatives in health, refugees, and disarmament laid the groundwork for the modern United Nations. And yes, that is very true. And it leads me to the next thing. Realism. We are going back to it as a science and we are looking under realism. The thing with realism proposed by Thomas Hobbes back in the 18th century, well, 17th century actually, and this is going to be fairly short. I'm going to keep this under an hour. Short and sweet, just like Sabrina Carpenter, huh? So the thing with realism, right, was that as the war ended, the international system expanded, and people, the UN found there was a fear of war. States joined the international system. They fled to it for protection, for solace, for guarantees, for peace. And the international system gained so much recognition, and it essentially enforced what Westphalia said, territorial sovereignty, what the Holy Alliance said, religious principles and religious sovereignty, what the Concert of Europe did, diplomatic efforts, again, Europe's here, diplomatic efforts. It enforced what the IPU meant in 1889. The Hague Conventions, it captured altogether states. Nowadays, they cannot exist without being part of the international system because states only gain recognition not by declaring themselves, but by getting others to declare them, because one can think one exists, but one may not be real if another person is not willing to acknowledge one's existence. That's the philosophy behind things. Nowadays, I could go into international system, but we can see this in T groups. I'm not gonna say the word that starts with terror because I just got banned on a video for speaking on eating disorders. Thank you, YouTube. But thing is, you never know. The international system is complex. It relies on the UN. They're synonymous, essentially. On the UN, I said US. Crap. It relies on the UN, and for states to gain recognition, for states to be powerful, for states to access free trade and different things, they need international recognition. They need codependence. That's one of the things that realism, well, not realism itself, but neo-realism. I'm busy. Neo-realism works on. And with neo-realism, it focuses on building ties, and commercial ties especially, to other nations. And that's why the League of Nations failed, because the world was not ready yet. And that's the main reason. World not ready. They were not ready to accept the international system. They were not ready to understand the Eurocentric need for peace. They were not ready to fear a sense of urgency. There wasn't such thing. The League of Nations could do nothing but fail, essentially. They failed to prevent the war. That was the main purpose of the League. Now, let me take my glasses off. Oh, I look kind of ugly without. So there you go, guys. There you have it. Again, it's always wonderful to be talking about this kind of things and to be here and to be discussing history. I love it completely. The first videos have kind of flopped, but all cool. Doesn't hurt at all. No, it doesn't hurt at all. I guess it's just one of the things growing this YouTube channel. I have another one that's mainly about music and me, myself. But again, wonderful to just be talking about this. And I'm willing to grow this channel. I need more video suggestions. I'm planning on, I know I say I can make a video on this, but in reality, I forget what I said. And I'm not the one to go looking for that through my video, because I don't know, I don't watch my content, quite frankly. Desire your Prince London, please leave your suggestions, advice, debate, anything. Just leave it down below, because if there's one thing that I'm gonna do is read. I believe in free speech, and I believe in opinions, and I believe that opinions are not equal to insults, and I believe that insults are relatively evolutionary. There you go. Desire Prince signing off. Bye-bye.